All right. Hello, everyone. Let's go and get started. A welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Gwyneth Daunton, and I'll be your host today for the webinar titled Ecological Silviculture for the Restoration and Adaptation in Conifer Ecosystems of the Interior West. We have an exciting presentation for you today with Andrew Larson, who is with the University of Montana, whereas he is the professor of forest ecology and the director of the Wilderness Institute. Andrew, we're really excited to have you today. We'll be introducing Andrew a little bit more later on, but we just want to remind you of some pre-webinar items. I would like to start out today's webinar with sharing NCTC's land acknowledgement with all of you. The National Conservation Training Center is located on the ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples. These include, but are not limited to, the Massawomac, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building these relationships with indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn more about the lands they reside on. If you are interested in learning more about who might have lived on your land or walked on your land, let me know in the comments, in the chat, and I'll share those links with you. I also want to mention that NCTC welcomes all students. It is my intention to create a safe and inclusive, productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas. We are strengthened by diverse perspectives and identities, and we will foster environments where everyone can learn new skills. As such, I will be an ally in the event that anyone experiences access issues or feels unwelcome. These concerns. And with Martin Luther King Day just yesterday, we really want to make sure that everyone feels welcome. First, a disclaimer. The views and opinions or positions expressed in today's webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not directly reflect the views and opinions and positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references do not imply federal endorsement. With that being said, we do have a couple links to papers from Andrew in the chat. So if you're interested in any of those, please go ahead and look at them. And just to give you a lay of the land, this webinar is being recorded and all participants have been muted, but we still want you guys to share who you are and where you are located. So if you want to pop into the chat and introduce yourself, please go ahead to do that now. Just make sure that the chat is to everyone, not just the presenters. Last but not least, please make sure to switch your view to side-by-side gallery. This will give you the best viewing experience of the presentation and the presenters, and then you also have the interpreters as well. So please make sure to have your setup correct. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff as he talks a little bit more about this webinar series. Jeff, take it away.
Thanks, Gwyneth, and thanks to each of you for joining us today. We're really looking forward to hearing what Andrew has to say about these Western conifer systems. So this webinar series has been put together by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, our Science Applications and Migratory Birds Program, and of course, the National Conservation Training Center has been a big help in hosting the series. But we've also been joined by the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, that's NIACS, and the USDA Forest Service in sponsoring this webinar series. So it's been a fun collaborative effort to work with folks on this. And so we reach out to both biologists and to foresters and to other resource managers. And you can see that between, we have a number of contacts up there, and you're welcome to reach out to any of us if you have more questions about the series. And Gwyneth, we should also put the link. So I'll put the link in a bit that where all our recordings are on the NIACS website. So I saw a couple questions in the chat asking about previous webinars. So these will all be recorded and they can be accessed at the NIACS YouTube site. Next slide, please. So this is the third 12-part monthly webinar series. And in this case, this series tells a story about how small and large scale forest disturbance, such as fire, wind, ice storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, flooding, and introduced endemic forest pets and other impact forest ecosystems. The series will also examine ecological silviculture and climate adaptation approaches to help inform forest and wildlife management. So, and also to run a commercial for our next upcoming webinar. That'll be on February 20th. And we try to always be on the third Tuesday of each month at 1 o'clock Eastern time, or in this case, Andrew's out on Mountain Time, so 11 Mountain Time. And so on the 20th, we're going to have Steve Jack. He's with the TLL Temple Foundation. He's going to be talking about climate adaptation strategies for longleaf pine ecosystems. So don't miss that one. He'll be talking about adapting to change in longleaf pine ecosystems, managing out of balance fire regimes, and resetting fire intervals. So next slide, please, so I can introduce Andrew. And so there you have Andrew. He looks pretty relaxed in this one, although come on, he can't be that relaxed right this second. But he's going to be talking about ecological silviculture for restoration, adaptation, and conifer ecosystems in the interior West. And as Gwyneth said, Andrew is a professor of forest ecology and also the director of the Wilderness Institute at the University of Montana. And he's in the Department of Forest Management there. Andrew has a BS in Forest Resources, and he has his PhD in ecosystem analysis from the University of Washington. And he has been faculty at the University of Montana since 2009. And Andrew's research focuses on disturbances and development of forest ecosystems. So he's right smack in the middle of what we want to be talking about in this series, and silvicultural approaches to enhance forest resilience and adaptive capacity. His research often draws on long-term experimental and observational data sets, as well as observations in large forested wilderness areas with active fire regimes. And I strongly recommend the 3 papers that are provided. They're pretty interesting. So with that, Andrew, please take it away. And I will have one reminder before Andrew takes it away, and that is we're going to try to stop about halfway through, and we'll take just a few questions then, and then we'll be able to take more questions at the end. So Andrew, if you want to signal me when you're ready to break, and if people have questions, you can start adding them in the chat early. That way I can grab a couple of them out of there when we're ready to stop. So thanks again for everybody joining us, and go ahead, Andrew.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to get into screen share mode and we'll get started. I can pull that off. Here we go. All right. Hopefully, first of all, can everybody hear me? Or
we can hear you. We can hear you well, and we're seeing right now. We're seeing your whole presentation. You're not quite in there. Looks like it's coming.
There we go. Very good.
All right.
Awesome.
So, first of all, thank you to the organizers and the Fish and Wildlife Service for having me. It's really an honor to be part of this community and to share with you today. My email is up there on the screen. You can feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'd love to hear from any of you and have a dialogue offline beyond what we can do here today. So I'm going to jump right in and start by saying that it's so exciting to be at a point where ecological forestry and ecological silviculture has gone mainstream. And you know, I was teaching an ecological silviculture graduate course a decade ago. And at that point, there were no textbooks, and we were kind of out there in a little bit in the Wild West in the sense that, you know, we were kind of making it up and helping push along some of those ideas right in the classroom. And now, you know, starting with the great textbook that Jerry Franklin led, and now 2 silviculture texts by Brian Palick and Tony D'Amato and others, we've got a really maturing body of science. And I'll just say a couple of words about sort of my take on ecological forestry. First, and I think, probably everybody knows this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. What really differentiates it is we start with ecological forestry from a knowledge base of ecological science first and foremost. And embedded right in sort of the top line management objectives and in the philosophy is this overriding objective to sustain ecological integrity and biodiversity. And that's worth highlighting because for, I don't know, a century or more, forestry has often treated those sorts of things as constraints, not as objectives. And so that's fundamentally different in ecological forestry. A big piece of ecological forestry is it's tethered to and informed by the natural disturbance regime. And so we're talking about management systems that attempt to work with, not against, disturbance processes. And, you can't talk about forest management without acknowledging and being serious about the financial aspects of it. And what differentiates, for me, ecological forestry from what I'll call sort of traditional forestry or agricultural or production forestry is a shift in the economic perspective to emphasizing cash flows, but not necessarily maximizing return on investment. And that comes with the increased focus on conservation and biodiversity and ecosystem integrity values. So there's a sort of background into sort of what I'm talking about when I talk about ecological forestry and ecological silviculture. And I'm going to give you two case studies today. The first, with my good friend and colleague, Derek Churchill, I was really delighted to be able to participate in Brian and Tony's new book. And I'm going to take you through basically our chapter in there on ecological silviculture for the dry mixed conifer and ponderosa pine ecosystem. So I'm going to start with that. And if I don't run out of time, I'm going to finish with another look at a new experiment that we just have kicked off in the upper elevation, the montane and subalpine mixed conifer forest here in the Northern Rockies. So let's get into it here with ponderosa pine and the dry mixed conifer. So when ecological silviculture rests first and foremost on knowledge of the disturbance regime and of the forest development model that's characteristic of that ecosystem. And so that's where I'm going to start here. And more than anything else, the ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer forests of the interior West depend on a regime of frequent surface fires. Now, there are bark beetles, oftentimes a really important element of the disturbance regime, pathogens, other insects, all of the other disturbance processes that are operating. But fire is really the one of overarching importance. And so to a certain degree, I'm going to pretend today like that's the only disturbance process we care about, but it's because it's just so dominant. And also because a lot of the regeneration opportunities are tied to fire disturbance in our Western conifer forests. So we're talking about a regime of frequent fires historically, every 5 to maybe 35 years. And there was a major component of intentional as well as incidental ignitions by Native Americans on top of the lightning ignited fire regime. And this frequent fire had the outcome or the effect on stand structure of maintaining what the sort of thing that you can see in the photos that I'm showing you here. Almost a savanna-like structure of low density. One of the characteristics is really patchy aggregated tree regeneration that's tied to patchy fire effects and creation of safe sites, mineral seed beds. A lot of times that's tied to aggregations of heavy fuels that burn a little longer, a little hotter, knock back some of the competing understory vegetation, such that you can have successful establishment of the fire tolerant and shade intolerant. Here I'm showing ponderosa pine, but I'm from Montana, Western Montana, and I also think a lot about Western larch, which is another important fire resistant sun loving species that really prefers these mineral seed beds. And so the recurring action of these fires and associated patchy and punctuated regeneration opportunities through time is the maintenance and sort of the perpetuation of a large tree dominated stand structure with low density, relatively low accumulations of fuels, surface fuels on the forest floor that sustain that low severity fire regime. And so you've got, I'll use some of these drawings from Bob Van Pelt that try to illustrate how the fires are functioning. It's dynamic through time, but maintaining sort of a shifting mosaic of patchy but open, heterogeneous stand structure. And so those frequent fires are consuming surface fuels. They're thinning out the small trees in the understory. Some of the pines are making it up into the middle story and eventually into the overstory. The other thing those fires are doing are maintaining a high base to live crown. The low overstory density keeps the canopy bulk density low enough so that when you do have torching, it generally won't support a spreading crown fire. And then of course, maintaining those patchy regeneration opportunities. So there's a quick sketch of the natural disturbance regime and developmental model in this forest. And so what I want to think some about now are what are the implications for an ecological silviculture system? And I apologize for all the text on the screen, but these are the sort of the 7 elements that we identified. And I've got these color coded here, and there's a reason for that. If you look at points 2, 4, and 6, and I should say, I'm going to walk through this with photos and sort of explanations of why, but I want to point out that points 2, 4, and 6 here have a lot in common with your sort of classic principles of fuel reduction treatments in pine and dry mixed conifer forests. And, that's an emphasis on retaining and maintaining the large trees, the most fire resistant trees, on maintaining a low stand density and really trying to reduce ladder fuels to make it, less likely that a fire is going to move from the forest floor into the canopy. And then to maintain low surface fuel loads that are conducive to a low severity fire regime. So, you can go to the classic paper on that, Agee and Skinner, and it's basically, I've changed the wording slightly, but those are those key points. But we're not talking about fuel reduction when we're talking about ecological silviculture. Here, we're thinking about and trying to lay out a framework for a sustainable long-term silvicultural system. And we've woven in some other elements here. And it starts with regeneration, which is, I think, a real departure from how we've thought about ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer forests for the last 30 years or more, where we've been focused almost singularly on fuel reduction and restoration. We've been focused on getting rid of trees, not regenerating them. But the fact of the matter is if you're interested in a long-term sustainable system, we have to be thinking about regenerating those fire-tolerant, drought-tolerant pines and larch. I tell you what, I think what I'm going to do is move right in and I'll walk you through all of these rather than just showing you this boring slide of text. So, regenerate fire-tolerant trees. Well, there's an example of it right there. In ponderosa pine, they're so shade tolerant that oftentimes you're going to accomplish this in some pretty significant canopy openings, sort of a group selection type of approach. And depending on your circumstances, you may have to turn to artificial regeneration. I'll come back to this later on in the talk when we talk about post-fire management a little bit. Recruit and perpetuate the large diameter and old trees. This is I don't know, this doesn't really require a whole lot of explanation in terms of how to do it, I think. But the why, I think, deserves a little bit. I mean, one of the reasons is that it takes centuries to grow a centuries-old tree. But there's so many functions tied up in the big and old tree. One of the things that they do is as they age, these trees accumulate decadence, complexity, and they've got the sort of habitat features that make them suitable for biodiversity as habitat. that the young model conforming trees just don't have. They also are relatively stable pools of carbons or stores of carbon. So the biggest fire resistant trees tend to hold that carbon sequestered much longer than, say, the forest floor pool or the small diameter trees. They're producing a large quantity of the pine litter that's going to carry the surface fires. So there's a lot of functional attributes that the big trees provide, and some of the crucial ones that really can't be duplicated by the younger, smaller trees. So keep them around and think about producing more of them through time. Now, the ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer forests are not high biomass systems. And so you got to get rid of that kind of classic old growth, the west side Douglas fir old growth, where there's abundant big trees and snags and logs everywhere. But I really got to emphasize this: big dead wood is still an essential part of these frequent fire ecosystems. And you've got to pay attention to recruiting and perpetuating some of that big wood. And these are really essential habitat features. And a lot of the functions and what species can make a living is tied to size and diameter. And so here, I've got this just awesome example of a great horned owl family. We've got this nest in this huge cavity where there's been a branch tear out, but there's more mundane, I guess, less charismatic, but still important uses. So here a tree squirrel's been using this log as a place to perch, or it's right in the middle of its midden, a little dense Douglas fir patch, where it looks like he's been eating ponderosa pine seeds there. But the point is these are structural elements of the natural forest, and we've got to pay attention to recruiting and retaining. And just, I can't help but share this to underscore how valuable these big snags are as habitat features. This is the same snag I was showing on the last slide, and you can see that mama owl there, she's upset, and it's because the blur you can see on the screen, she's being dive bombed by an American kestrel that's using the same snag at the same time, and she's got her own family in the upstairs apartment. So the point is that you've really got to be paying attention to and taking steps to provision the ecosystem with these large diameter snags and eventually logs through time, even in the frequent fire ecosystems. All right, maintain low tree density with few ladder fuels. And when I say low density, we mean it. And that might mean as low as 15 to 30% of maximum stand density index. That's what fire did and does to these frequent fire ecosystems. And there's a tremendous amount of resilience and adaptive capacity that comes from that low density, low competition condition. By maintaining stand structure well below maximum sort of carrying capacity or max stocking, you're providing resistance and resilience to drought and to bark beetles, as well as to fire. And so what it does is it lets those natural disturbance agents that I just mentioned function in a way that maintains ecological integrity and the sort of stand structure, rather than sort of getting away and moving into that really sort of disequilibrium, high severity regime that just is not characteristic of these environments. When we start doing active management in this forest type, one of the things that Derek and I and others have put a lot of effort into over the years is approaches to help managers and active treatments preserve and maintain and enhance that spatial variability that's a defining feature of the natural developmental model. And the top row here, I'm showing you a picture and a corresponding map. That's what the yellow-orange background is with the green dots. The green dots are trees. And that top row shows basically what not to do. And that's to not sort of create this homogeneous, uniform, even spacing that we don't find in a functional sort of natural conditions or environments where fire is maintaining strand structure, and instead really deliberately create and maintain that patchy, spatially variable mosaic that emerges from that functioning frequent fire regime. And so the bottom row, where you're seeing big open spaces and embedded in a matrix of trees with varying densities and aggregation or clump sizes of trees. And we've got everything from widely spaced individuals to small, medium, and large clumps of trees. But then we've got big open spaces. I want to take just a minute and try to convince you a little bit of why that's important. So why do we care about pattern? And it goes back to that all important structure function relationship in ecosystems, especially in forest ecosystems. If we look across lots of different ecosystem functions, whether it's snow retention or understory plant diversity and cover or understory plant productivity, to habitat use and occupancy by birds and small mammals, all of those different things are sensitive to pattern. I mean, there's a whole discipline, landscape ecology, that focuses on the relationship between pattern and process. So we care about it on one hand because of all of these functions that are governed by or influenced by pattern. But then the other thing, sort of going back to the fundamentals of stand development, is that the variable patterns of stand structure are themselves a key driver of forest development and the perpetuation of that multi-age fine-scale mosaic that's a defining feature of this forest. And so as we think about ecological forestry as being informed by and interfacing with the natural disturbance regime, managing and maintaining that variable pattern that then feeds into variable disturbance effects and subsequent stand development is a major part of that. Now, these are frequent fire ecosystems, so full stop, period. And so doing ecological forestry here in this forest type really means that we've got to bring fire into it. And in the West, that is hard. It's an uphill battle. And I will say I'm not a fire expert. And so it's even harder from my perspective because I don't know anything about it. But seriously, we've got challenging conditions, small burn windows, oftentimes a challenging regulatory environment and a challenging social and political environment. But nevertheless, it's absolutely essential. And so, as we're thinking about the guidance to maintain and manage our surface fuels so that we get the sorts of fire behavior that supports stand development processes that we're interested in maintaining, the best way to do that is with prescribed fire. But I want to acknowledge that it's hard. But I guess the encouragement that I give you is don't give up and build the relationships and the capacity and just continue to strive for that. And part of that, this is just an awesome, I use this photo all the time. It's from Steve Rondeau after the bootleg fire in Southwest Oregon. These are fire dependent ecosystems. And very pragmatically, you can see here that one of the reasons prescribed fire is so important is that when the forests that we're talking about are inevitably going to be challenged by wildfire, when we've had prescribed fire and been using it as a management tool, our forests are in a condition to receive and interact positively with that unplanned wildfire, where the wildfire now is serving to maintain and enhance conditions rather than burn with uncharacteristically severe effects. And so this is the other benefit. And of course, there are going to be benefits that accrue to the other things that we're thinking about with respect to fire management. Protection of people and infrastructure and being able to manage and stop wildfires are also going to be enhanced by having that footprint and legacy of prescribed fire on the ground. And then finally, the last point that's just important, essential even, to not lose sight of is that as much as I love trees, and I'm very much a tree guy, we can't forget about the understory and the broadleaf trees. You know, these are conifer ecosystems, and conifers are amazing. They're the oldest trees, the biggest trees. They can handle drought. They're all these amazing things, but they don't produce flowers. They don't fix nitrogen. They don't support pollinators. And so there's all kinds of ecosystem functions that go on in the understory. And so the complete picture of sustaining and managing our dry mixed conifer forest really relies on paying attention to and taking care of the understory community. And, you know, part of that's going to do things like provide for these sorts of critters that a lot of people, a lot of the public cares really deeply about. Okay, so those are so 7 different elements that we identify, like things, guiding principles, whatever you want to call them, to kind of keep in mind as you craft treatments and prescriptions and go about, you know, putting together a forest management system in this type. Now, there's a really wide range of conditions out there on the landscape, and you know, the legacy of fire suppression, of past harvest, of increasingly high severity wildfire that's uncharacteristic, other land uses, you know, give us a current condition right now that's pretty departed from the natural model. And I'm just going to quickly, I don't know, maybe quickly walk you through a sample of different sort of initial conditions and show you how an ecological silvicultural approach could proceed from these sorts of different initial conditions. And so, and we've got a green forest that's high density and even aged, high density, but with multiple cohort. You know, how do we handle when those conditions are then challenged by wildfire and you have moderate to severe effects? And then finally, that low density multi-cohort, how do we sustain that sort of desired condition through time? So probably, I don't know if this is true. I'm going to say it's true. I've probably thought the most about this, and this is where we've done sort of a lot of fuel reduction and restoration work is aimed at these sort of even age, high density initial conditions where, you know, a lot of times this is the combined legacy of high grade harvesting early on of the big old fire resistant trees combined with a century or more of fire exclusion. And, you know, there the generic guidance is to basically use a variable density thinning type of approach with explicit guidance to help create and maintain that spatial variability, and taking into account all the other guidelines that I've described. You know, the ICO, or individual clumps and openings method, is a really natural approach in this sort of initial condition. And that's basically, I'll go to the next slide here and try to illustrate it with a picture. But you know, once you've identified your target residual density, your target density you want to bring the stand down to, then we've got to proceed with sort of layout and treatment design in a way that allows for that spatial variability. So one of the things that we encourage folks to do is to go ahead and lay out places where you want to create openings and places where you want to have a no entry skip. You want to implement in your marking guide or your designation by description sort of guidelines that go to the operator, your preferences for what, you know, what sort of tree selection guidelines, you know, it's going to favor the fire resistant trees, the big and old trees. We're going to pay attention to the large snags and logs and wildlife trees. And then the ICO approach is just a way to translate density statements or guidelines, like say, hey, we want to leave on average 40 trees per acre. Well, there's nothing about spatial variability in that statement, but we can do some math and come up with across our total unit, how many trees do we want to leave as widely spaced individuals, and how many trees do we want to leave in clumps, groups of closely spaced trees of different sizes. And you can give those sorts of guidelines to either to your tree marking crew or to your operator, and move right out and get to work and get a result, or at least more likely to get a result that you're happy with. Now, what about this starting condition? This is, you know, this fire excluded condition, but where the big old trees weren't removed. And so here it's even, I think, even easier. And the basic guidance is anchor your treatments around those big trees you want to protect, focus on ladder fuel reduction around them. And then I'll say the matrix, you want to implement a variable density approach. ICO or similar is going to be a good tool there to begin to move towards that multi-cohort low density condition that sort of defines the natural system. One of the things that we've learned from doing this for, I don't know, more than a decade now, is that real-time implementation monitoring is hugely important. A few years back, Sean Geronimo, with some support from the Nature Conservancy, developed a little tablet app, and we did a trial that showed that real-time monitoring with that app led to demonstrably better outcomes. And we've gone so far as to give that to operators and say, hey, monitor your own work, and track as you're going your progress in terms of your clump targets, how many singles and clumps of different sizes. And this is just an incredibly powerful tool. One of the things that's really striking is it totally changes the type of conversations you have with the operator, because now you're talking about data that they've been active in capturing and collecting. And it's totally different than a sort of a punitive contract compliance approach where you come out and say, well, why aren't you doing it the way I want it? So it's turned out to be a really productive thing. And I want to add one thing, exciting development. I'm not really involved except as sort of an advisor. There's a local firm here in Missoula that's working on putting stereo cameras on the equipment, and then in real time processing those stereo images into tree selection and real-time mapping, and then into sort of a heads-up display of stand structure and those ICO metrics that the operator can react to and see their progress in real time. So that's coming down the line. It's really exciting. But then, okay, these green tree treatments, the job's not done. I already said this, until you follow and until you've burned it. You got to follow it with fire. And in many ways, I think it's probably the crux in terms of it being the hardest part, but that you really have got to follow that through. Okay, let's talk a little bit about wildfire. I got to speed up. I know I'm going fast, but holy cow. More and more, the conditions that I've been talking about, that sort of fire excluded, wildfire is getting to them before we're able to engage in restoration or ecological silviculture. One of the things, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, this is my perspective, but I think it's reasonable. I've noticed that wildfires often seem to trigger a switch from primarily an ecologically based to more of an economically based perspective. And it's sort of this like, well, it burned up, throw my hands up and walk away. I'm going to pick on, as an example, a local project here on the Lolo National Forest from a few years back. They had developed this big, like 50,000 acre planting area, the Center Horse Restoration Project. NEPA was signed, they were ready to go to work, and then it burned in 2017, a major fire year. The Rice Ridge fire burned through it. And these are quotes out of the salvage EA. After the fire, the Center Horse project was set aside, and many of the proposed beneficial outcomes are foregone. And I think that we have to not do that. And if you look at the EA, you see they have three things identified, and these are fine. Okay, there's nothing wrong with these, but there's like ecological silviculture went out the window after that fire. And it didn't have to. It didn't have to. And as ecological foresters, we got to keep in mind that we work with the disturbance regime, even when it's doing things we don't like. And so, we had a big project funded by the Joint Fire Science Program a few years ago. And it was all about post-fire management. And this is one of the papers that we shared with you. But after a wildfire like that, I think it's essential for us to ask, three types of questions. Where did the fire do beneficial work for us? Because the fire drives these systems. So it's not all bad. I mean, I promise you that. And then where did fire help us out, but not quite finish the job? And then, of course, where did fire overshoot and cause new problems, new issues that we're going to have to deal with? And of course, we know that happens. So, real quickly here, thinking about how do we react in an ecological forestry framework after low and moderate severity fire? And a lot of times this sort of severity is doing a bunch of good work for us. But I got to move standby here. But a lot of times there's a real opportunity or need to basically finish the job. And, that's when the fire didn't remove as many trees as we would have in a green tree treatment, like the ones that I was talking about a moment ago. And I'm going to use an example from James Pass. James is a silviculturist on the Colville National Forest. And, he's got a great example of this sort of philosophy and this approach of reacting to wildfire. So in 2015, they had a big wildfire event burn through a NEPA planting area, and they had units laid out, painted, NEPA signed, ready to go. And if you focus on unit 369 there, you can see here's the pre-fire image. And then the post-fire image, you can see that the fire got in there, but it really didn't do that much. It killed a bunch of trees in some pockets, but relative to what they had prescribed, it would have liked to have seen some more trees taken out. And ultimately, that's what James did, was to update the prescription to focus on retaining the big trees and the fire-resistant trees that had survived, and those that had died, keeping those to provide for snags and large wood recruitment. And then thinking about fuels management, which is a big part of what you're concerned post-fire is, if you start with an uncharacteristically high stand structure, kill a bunch of those trees, and you're going to have a big input of fuels and have really uncharacteristically high fuel loads going forward. I'm watching the clock here. All right. So what about the high severity patches? The framework that we've pushed, and I think I've pushed it too hard, I'll admit, is to ask the question, okay, is this sort of environment likely to be climate limited or not in the future? And, there's increasing focus on the areas in the landscape that are sort of trailing edge, the marginal forests where once they burn or whatever severe disturbance, it's so hot and so dry, we're not likely to get a forest back. And those sorts of places, we probably want to just let them go, right? Don't allocate resources to there. But not every high severity patch has that sort of climate limitation. Some high severity patches are going to be located in places that are going to continue as forest. At least the climate and the environment will support forest. And as I'm trying to show in these pictures here, we've got abundant seed source. So this sort of environment, you might need to worry about fuels management. You might need to think about, am I getting the type or the species composition of regeneration that I want? But fundamentally, you're on a trajectory to get forest back. But then you've got places like this, where climate's suitable for trees, but holy cow, it's a long ways from any seed source. And so you may not be getting much forest regeneration for a long time if you don't help it out with some planting. All right, I got a pet peeve here I want to share. I've just sort of learned this recently. I have an awesome student doing a great project on drought conditioning seedlings, and we outplanted a bunch this year. And so I've been paying way more attention to planting than I have in the past. And okay, a couple of things. So planting is a great way to overcome dispersal limitation. Those big patches where you're seed limited, fine. It's also an excellent option for both resist and direct climate adaptation strategies. So resisting, if you take a great big robust nursery grown seedling, they can handle challenging environments better than natural regeneration a lot of times. And so there's this sort of challenging area environmentally where they can really help us maintain a forest on the landscape. And then of course we can direct by moving species and genotypes around and taking that sort of approach. And then the really important point I want to make here is that I encourage you to not restrict your planting to the locations that your decision support tools say that you're going to have 100% success in terms of seedling survival. one of the things that planting can do for us is help us deal with those challenging environments. So I'm hung up on this because I feel like I've seen our guidance to avoid planting in the areas that are just not likely to come back into forest has turned into only planting in the most moist, benign environments. And that's leaving this big middle ground without attention. And so don't do that. That's my guidance there. Okay, and then finally, when you get to that target condition, how do we maintain it? And I think this is the fun. It's still pretty rare, but we're accumulating on the landscape a lot of opportunity for this, because as we have more and more area on the landscape that's had an initial fuel reduction or restoration type treatment, and now they need to be maintained through time, it's an opportunity to really embrace the sort of ecological forestry and approach. Now, first, I got to acknowledge that, fire, human fire and naturally ignited fires have been doing this for millennia, and it's an option. We can use managed wildfire to maintain these conditions. And of course, it's going to be places like parks and refuges and wildlife or wilderness areas where that's often the case. This is some central Idaho, beautiful pine mixed conifer forests where, these are managed wildfires that have, maintained this condition you're looking at. But we can also use multi-age management to do this. And basically, I'm showing you a picture of an operation in an incredibly well-managed private ranch up to Blackfoot here in Western Montana, where they're able to do this sort of management. And, it involves, basically individual and small group selection, including through time, the opportunity and even need to take some of those big trees, but you can maintain and manage and perpetuate the large tree population through time. You're not going to get rich doing it. I'll acknowledge that. And it also takes a lot of discipline to make sure you're not starving the site of the big snags and wood. But, you're going to be able to use group selection to get the regeneration that you're looking for. And then, of course, fire has got to be a component of this. I'm almost out of time, and rather than take questions right now, I'm going to skip ahead and show you like 2 slides, this whole other topic, and then we'll have some Q&A and discussion at the end, if that's okay. All right, we're going to leave frequent fire behind and go to a totally different ecosystem. This is a stand replacement to mixed severity ecosystem. And the species composition here is Western larch, Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce, and subalpine fir. And I hate it when people do this, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to click through a whole bunch of stuff and show you this guy. This is the snowshoe hare. And it turns out this is great habitat for snowshoe hare, this forest type. And snowshoe hare really like young sort of cohort establishment to stem exclusion, early stem exclusion, especially lodgepole pine. And then they also really like this old stand structure that you see on the right here. This sort of multi-canopy layers, foliage all the way to the ground. It gives them hiding cover and it gives them something to eat. And especially in the winter, they really like that young stuff. Now, lynx are also in this system here. And, lynx, their primary prey are the snowshoe hare. And they also really prefer or even need that complex, large tree, multi-story structure for denning habitat, and their reproductive success really depends on how much of that sort of old growth you have in the landscape. So the legacy of past harvests and increasingly of wildfire has given us a superabundance of the young stuff and a real shortage of the old stuff across the landscape. And so the question is, can we accelerate that and get through that sort of classic stem exclusion stage that both the lynx and the hare really don't care for? And I'm going to click through a whole bunch of other stuff here and show you this. I'm really excited with some great collaborators, Mike Shadell with the Nature Conservancy, Justin Croteau, with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And then the managers at the BLM, Jody Weltzstein and John Fothergill and Andy Reed with the Flathead National Forest. So we've had just over multiple years of effort, we've put together a new operational scale experiment that is designed to work in these young forests and test some new approaches to design to accelerate the development of that multi-story canopy structure and do some other things that really are focused in adaptation. And that's thinking about, can we use silvicultural treatments to prolong snow cover and do things like reduce coat color mismatch, where you have a white winter hare on a brown background, and maintain habitat and hiding cover for snowshoe hares in the short term. And so we've got 6 reps of this experiment distributed across Western Montana. We just finished implementation this fall at the last site. And I'm showing you some pictures of this. The distinguishing features of this approach is the inclusion of really substantial reserves, daylighting approaches, so variable thinning intensity, where we're focused on sort of releasing select trees and leaving a more or less unthinned matrix, so high cover for those hares. And you can see this is a view from afar, some big retention blocks, in the hopes that we can provide in the short term for these guys, while over the long term, redeveloping in a shorter amount of time that really limiting high quality multi-story habitat. And I'll just end with this. We're calling this adaptive complexity thinning, in a bigger term, adaptive complexity silviculture. And the sort of the hallmarks are that it's ecologically based, it's informed by the natural model and the disturbance regime. It embraces and really is informed by the sort of classic structure function relationships. And here we're thinking about snowshoe hare and lynx habitats and canopy snow interactions. But then we have, in a very direct, meaningful way, we're bringing adaptation into it. And we're thinking about, how can we use silviculture to help snowshoe hares that are having to deal with coat color mismatch and changing snowpack conditions, as we sort of grapple with the altered and diminished abundance of the multi-story habitat across the landscape. So this is my last slide. I apologize for rushing through there at the end. I hope I at least tease this. I don't have any results to give you on this last part anyway. Hopefully you can have me back in a couple of years to share results. But I'm going to stop here and save the last 5, 6, 7 minutes to respond to questions and comments that folks have.
Well, so that was great, Andrew, and you'd certainly got people's juices boiling, because there's lots of questions in here. So I'll start with a comment from Emily, and she simply says, federal funding for post-fire plantings has limitations and strict policies for what's allowed and not allowed. So the inference there is that, hey, with these strict issues, these strict policies, how do we do the kinds of things that you're suggesting we do? And so I'll further that along and say, are you able to get the for instance, in some of the U.S. Forest Service planning docs, are you able to get the 15 to 30% SDI max, written into that? Same thing with the adaptive complexity silviculture. Are you able to get that written into plans, so we have some justification when we have these other policies that are not easy to bend? I'll let you run with that.
Yeah, no, that is a great question and a great comment. And I'll probably disappoint you with my non-committal answer by saying that we've known for a long time that there are sort of some policy guidance and requirements that have not kept up with ecological knowledge. So I guess I'll recognize that right out of the gate, and that, that's true in some of the national forest policy that governs reforestation and things like that. But on the other hand, I'm gonna say that I've met a lot of incredibly creative silviculturists and decision makers, line officers and decision makers who seem to be able to find a way to make things work. And a lot of times it means extra effort. Like, how do I, shoehorn this crazy ecological forestry prescription into my standard contracting language? But it can be done. But beyond that, I think the other thing I'll say is that while it's not the role or the job of federal managers, land managers, to change policy, policy is changeable. It's a living thing. And so, maybe it's a call then to those of you, those of us who have access into the policy side of things to help move that along. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's what I've got.
Pretty satisfying to me. I'm not sure about for others. So here's one from Kevin, and it's a pretty simple question. And he simply asks, is salvage logging controversial in the West?
Oh,
so
absolutely.
that also has implications for
That's a great question.
So
it is, and especially it's still really controversial in the Northern Rockies and the Northwest. I've heard that it's not as big a deal in the Southwest just because there's not the mill capacity and infrastructure. But yeah, that the legacy, from the sort of the big salvage days of the 90s and early 2000s is still a thing out here. You'll notice when I was talking about post-fire management, I was very careful to not use the word salvage. Salvage is an economic activity. It's not an ecological activity. I did use the phrase post-fire harvest, and in the frequent fire ecosystems, a lot of times there's a real credible ecological basis to do post-fire harvest because we're thinking about managing the fuel bed and the development as all those fire-killed trees over the next decade come down. That's going to be a really challenging environment to do prescribed fire and sort of manage in there going forward. But it's semantics on one hand, but I think it's really crucial that as ecological foresters, if we're talking about doing post-fire harvest to manage fuels, there's an economic element in there, but the primary motivation in that circumstance, and that's what I was talking about, is not economic salvage. Now, I'm not saying economic salvage is bad or anything like that. It's a valuable and important objective, but we have to be disciplined, I think, in what we communicate and in sort of what it means for us and sort of why are we doing the things that we're doing. So that's a great question. And it is, I participated last spring in a panel at the Society for it was like Environmental and Natural Resource Journalism meeting. And the whole point of that was the controversy around salvage logging and post-fire management. And the other thing I'll say real quickly is that the bulk of the science on salvage impacts out there in the literature is focused on severe, intense economic salvage following intense high severity disturbances. There's a real void in the literature of post-disturbance, post-fire management that's done at a lower intensity following lower severity disturbances. We don't have a lot of science on that. I'm making the case that there's a real need a lot of times from a fuels perspective, but I don't think we should take science that was developed from like clear cutting after massive severe standard replacement disturbances and say what we know from that system is going to guide selective removal following moderate severity fire in a previously fire excluded ponderosa pine forest. That's like apples and oranges. It's not even apples and it's like, I don't know the metaphor or whatever, but that's not the same thing. So the scientists need to get on that. Is there time for, let's do one more question if we can do it.
Hey, you're not long-winded, and we're going to try to chain you for another 5 minutes or so. Gwyneth has said we can hang on for a bit. So Gwyneth, also, if you can post the link again, I know you did post it already for me for the recordings because folks are saying, oh, I want to rewatch this. So I did want to catch, so there was one question I think you can answer really quickly, and that was Olivia had asked, whether Sean Geronimo's app, and I think that's an individual clump and opening ratio app, what the name of that is, and is it publicly available?
It is
Are you
publicly
familiar with it?
available.
Okay.
I'll admit it's getting kind of old. It probably needs some version updates. We put it up on the web a few years back, and it's there and you can download it, and it runs on the Android operating system. I'm gonna be honest and say I don't know how current it is, because I haven't used it in a year or two.
Okay. But that's on your website. That's on University of Montana's.
It is. We published it through the University of Montana library system through the I forget what they call it, but if you search Geronimo Churchill Larson app, there's also a Journal of Forestry paper where we published a test of it. And I can maybe after the fact, I can make that available to you, and you can distribute it if people, or you can just reach out directly to me. But
Okay.
the Journal of Forestry paper should lead you to it, and a careful Google search ought to get you to the University Library webpage where that material is hosted.
All right, so there's a lot of good questions in here. So,
yeah.
So let me give this. So this is from Evan, and he's kind of on the other end of the salvage issue, and he's saying, given the significant deficit of large old growth trees greater than 150 years old-ish, relative to historic conditions in frequent fire forests, plus their numerous keystone functions, is there any ecologically based justification for removing them? And I guess that goes back to,
There's not.
Yeah, okay.
No, there's not. And I want to be really clear when I talk about post-fire harvest, just like in that sample prescription that I showed from James Pass on the Colville, those big trees that you would protect and keep in a green tree treatment, we're going to protect and keep those not in a salvage, in a post-fire fuels management treatment. Like that big wood, I mean, I just can't emphasize enough how important it is. And I will also say that we're probably going to keep more of the sort of small and medium diameter snags around in a post-fire fuels treatment than a strict fuels driven prescription would take us, because we're really interested and concerned with sustaining the woodpeckers and the insects that are going to be using the dead wood and all the other ecosystem functions that are tied to that. So please don't interpret me as making the case for pulling all the big trees out of the system. That's not the point of that. The point that I was trying to make is that after a moderate and more severe wildfire, uncharacteristically severe, you're going to end up with this huge pulse of fuels, which is also uncharacteristic, and it's going to be really difficult to get the fire behavior and effects that we're trying to maintain out of that fuel bed. And so that's, that kind of underpins the case for doing that finish the job type of treatment that I was talking about. But yeah, I hope I'm being clear there, and that you can kind of take away I guess the nuance and the conservatism and the restraint that I'm encouraging you to approach that post-fire active management with. Anyway, good question.
So I'm going to ask you two more questions here,
Okay.
and one's pretty quick, I think. So this was from Carl, and this is very specific, related to Rocky Mountain juniper. He's saying, is there any place for mature 12 to 24 inch diameter Rocky Mountain juniper as sporadic understory for wildlife biodiversity, especially in the margins of natural mountain meadows, since it's such an important winter wildlife food?
I would say absolutely. I mean, I'm not expert on that species and all the different species that rely on it, but the general sort of guiding principle of retaining the different elements of diversity still stands. So I'd say absolutely. I see students. I'm gonna pick on my undergraduate students for a moment. here in Western Montana, a lot of their sort of capstone experiences end up being in the sort of dry mixed conifer. And a lot of times they're working with, previously fire excluded forests, and they come back and a lot of times their first draft prescription is like, get rid of everything except pine and larch. And we got to kind of like help them walk back a little bit and say like, we're interested in rebalancing the species composition, but anytime you start taking a native species and say, we're going to get rid of it, that's a little bit of a red flag for me. And I try to kind of walk them back a little bit. Maybe we messaged a little bit too hard on low density and high fire resistance with them. But anyway, that's a good question.
So as stewards, I'm really interested in the point on the policy, how to, as managers that are out there really responsible for the resource, how do we build this into our planning and our, so we can justify the things that we know we need to do. And so Eleanor's question is along those lines, I think. And so I'm going to read this to you and see if you take it the same way I would. Okay. Agree with not doing a standard full planting after in challenging sites. So again, we're back to the planting on these really intense burns. Fire can be a great opportunity to create a diverse mosaic on the landscape. That early successional habitat is some of the most diverse out there, with forb and shrub generation post-fire. It's a shame in our current system, we skip over the step often, spray it out, plant the dugs, and move on. So how do we get out of this kind of traditional approach? And have you been successful in building in some of these desired future condition prescriptions so that we can justify it?
So I'm going to make an assumption here. It sounds to me like, was this Eleanor?
Yeah,
is coming from the west side of the Pacific Northwest. I hear a spray the dove.
And she said that, and she had parenthetically coming from a Western forestry perspective.
Yeah. So, I'm gonna say a few things in response to that. So yes, first of all, what a lot of us call that complex early cereal habitat in the west side stand replacement forest. That's regionally limiting in terms of its abundance, and it's incredibly important for biodiversity. And there's more and more new science coming out on that all the time. I just was at last month the Association for Fire Ecology meeting, and there's just awesome work coming out of the University of Washington and Oregon State University and other groups looking at exactly that, the Washington DNR. So we know that there's room for improvement there. Now, that being said, not every landowner has a suite of objectives that leads them to ecological forestry. And so, I'm not going to hold it against an industrial landowner who's operating inside the law and who has a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders or to the trustees. If we want to look at an organization like DNR, for example, if they're practicing more sort of high intensive forest management practices, because it's responsive to their objectives. Okay, but I finally get to the meat of what I want to get across here. I think what we have to be careful of as foresters and silviculturists is making sure our approaches, the tools that we use, the prescriptions we write, whatever, the treatments, are best aligned with the landowner's objectives or the guiding policy, whatever. And so what I mean by that is if you're working for a landowner who's got a serious sort of conservation or ecological, for lack of a better term, objectives, then I hope that you're not using practices that are more appropriate to that intensive, high yield, economically driven forestry. And I see that a lot. I mean, it's a hard job. You spend your career doing one kind of forestry, you have all the tool sets, you know how to do it, and then you go to work for a different landowner. You got to make sure that you're like pulling the right tools out of the toolbox if the objectives change. So I don't want to suggest Eleanor or you or anybody else is sort of doing that, but that's something that I see, and you get comfortable with what you know how to do, And then if circumstances change or the management objectives change, you got to make sure that you're doing the things that fit those objectives. Anyway, awesome question. And, thanks for letting me think and talk about it.
Yeah, so you're getting, I'm sure you're seeing it go up the screen, lots of applause. And so,
Yeah.
Andrew, thanks a lot. That was a great discussion. Nice to really talk about ecological silviculture and how we can apply it on the landscape. And there were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, excellent ones, but this was great. So thank you. You really engaged the group. So thanks for doing that. And thanks to everyone that joined us. Hope you guys got a lot out of it and have.
Yeah,
and
well,
hopefully,
Jeff, thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for the chance to speak with you in the Q&A and discussion that we've had. And you have my email. Reach out if you want to talk. And I want to just close by saying I'm so impressed by the community that you've built. This is a huge group, and the Fish and Wildlife Service deserves a huge amount of credit for building up such a successful webinar series, and I'm grateful to have been a part of it.
well, thank you so much for that. And again, it's been a community effort. So again, if we didn't have great speakers like you, Andrew, then nobody would show up. So that's the deal. So thanks so much, and thanks for everybody participating.